Here is what I think this pattern suggests, and I want to be careful about how I frame it because I don't have answers. I have patterns. Energy, throughout human history, has been the fundamental source of economic and political power. Whoever controls the ability to do work, to move things, build things, process things, communicate things, controls the shape of civilization itself. The history of energy is therefore not primarily a history of technology. It is a history of control. When a technology appears that threatens the control mechanism, that offers power without scarcity, energy without metering, light and heat and motion without a bill attached, it doesn't fail because it doesn't work. It fails because making it work is incompatible with the interests of the people positioned to decide what gets developed and what gets buried. This is not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It doesn't require a room full of men in agreement. It only requires that the institutional incentives consistently reward suppression and consistently punish development of energy technologies that cannot be owned and sold. And those incentives have been consistent. Historically, empirically, demonstrably consistent. The archival trail doesn't end. That's the thing I keep returning to when the scale of what I'm describing starts to feel like too much. The Baghdad Battery is in the Iraq Museum, or it was before the events of 2003, when the museum was looted. Its current location is, and this is in the official record, uncertain. Hero of Alexandria's complete works exist only in Byzantine manuscripts, several of which are held at restricted access in monastic archives on Mount Athos, accessible only to male Orthodox pilgrims. Tesla's most sensitive notebooks are in a repository that the FBI files describe but do not name. Morey's detector is in a private family archive that no credentialed laboratory has been allowed to examine. Schauberger's original implosion turbine prototypes, built in Austria in the early 1940s, are listed in the archives of the Victor Schauberger Research Institute as location unknown. These materials exist, or they existed, or they exist and someone has decided that their existence should remain quiet. I don't know which. What I know is this: the history of energy is not the history of discovery and development and improvement we were taught. It is a history of discovery, suppression, rediscovery, and suppression again, stretching back further than we're comfortable admitting, and continuing, the pattern suggests, into the present. The machines that powered ancient cities, or might have, are in filing cabinets and museum basements and monastery libraries and unnamed government repositories. Some are almost certainly gone. Some are almost certainly not. And somewhere, in a room I can't name, in an archive that hasn't been declassified, in a drawer that hasn't been opened in decades, there is probably something that would change everything. The question isn't whether it's there. The question is who decided you shouldn't see it. Let me be fair to the official narrative because it deserves that fairness before we interrogate it. The official story goes like this. Human civilizations have always been energy constrained. For most of recorded history, that meant muscle power, animal and human, supplemented by wind and water where geography allowed. The Industrial Revolution unlocked coal on a massive scale, and that released a torrent of productive energy that built the modern world. When electricity arrived, it did so through the labors of known inventors working within known paradigms: Faraday, Edison, Tesla, Westinghouse. Their work was competitive, sometimes vicious, sometimes brilliant, but fundamentally a marketplace of ideas in which the best technologies won. What we have today, fossil fuels supplemented by nuclear and the growing edge of renewables, represents the logical progression of that history. Anomalies exist, certainly. There are technologies that didn't develop as fast as they might have, research programs that were defunded, inventors who died in obscurity. But the mainstream view holds these as the ordinary casualties of technological progress. The marketplace is imperfect. Incumbents protect their interests. This is normal. That's the official position, and it's not wrong on its surface. What it fails to account for is the archaeological record. Because when you go back further, much further, the story becomes substantially stranger. Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers are where the pattern first becomes visible. In 1936, a German archaeologist named Wilhelm Koenig was cataloging objects from the Baghdad Museum when he encountered something that defied easy categorization. It was a ceramic vessel, roughly 14 centimeters tall, containing a copper cylinder surrounding an iron rod, sealed with asphalt at both ends. Koenig published a paper the following year suggesting it was, in essence, a galvanic cell, a battery. Not a metaphorical battery. Not a ceremonial object that happened to resemble one. A functional electrochemical device. The object dated to somewhere between 250 BCE and 640 CE, depending on the analysis. Even the most conservative dating puts it roughly 1,000 years before Alessandro Volta constructed what Western science officially credits as the first battery in 1799. The mainstream response to Koenig's finding was measured skepticism. The object, now known as the Baghdad battery, has been tested. Replicas filled with grape juice or vinegar do produce voltages, around 1.1 volts in most tests. But archaeologists have argued, with some justification, that this doesn't prove ancient electrochemical knowledge. It might have been used for electroplating. It might have served ritual purposes we don't understand. It might be coincidence of form. Here's what no one explains well. Why, if this was a known and functional technology, did it disappear entirely? If even one culture understood the galvanic principle well enough to engineer a working cell, the practical applications, electroplating at scale, electrochemical refining, even primitive signaling, were substantial. Enough to spread. Enough to persist. And yet the archaeological record shows no continuation, no elaboration, no legacy technology that descends from it. It appears fully formed and then vanishes. That's not how useful technology behaves. That's how suppressed technology behaves. Speaking of archaeological anomalies, there's a thread that leads from Baghdad to the eastern Mediterranean coast, and it's one I wasn't expecting to find. In the ancient port city of Alexandria, in the library, but more precisely in the attached research institution known as the Mouseion, there existed, in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, a concentration of scientific intellect that has no real parallel in the ancient world. Euclid worked there. Eratosthenes worked there. Archimedes, though based in Syracuse, maintained correspondence with researchers in Alexandria so voluminous that his letters survive in partial form in Vatican archives to this day. What interests me specifically is the work of Hero of Alexandria, who operated roughly in the 1st century CE. Hero is known in classical scholarship primarily as a mathematician and an engineer. He wrote extensively on mechanical devices, and among his documented inventions is something called the Yalopile, a sealed sphere mounted on a pivot, with 2 bent tubes emerging from its sides. Water inside the sphere was heated to produce steam, which escaped through the tubes and caused the sphere to rotate. The Yalopile is described in most textbooks as a curiosity. Toy. A demonstration of steam pressure with no practical application in its time. But Hero also documented geared mechanisms, programmable automata using rope and drum logic, and this is the part that matters, at least 3 devices that historians of technology have described as precursors to the hydraulic press, the differential gear, and a form of odometer accurate enough for large-scale surveying. These were not toys. These were infrastructure-grade instruments. The question that follows is almost too obvious. If Hero's Alexandria possessed steam power, gear systems, and precision measurement simultaneously, why didn't that combination produce an industrial revolution in the ancient world? The components were present. The institutional support, the Mouseion, the patronage of the Ptolemaic court was substantial. The official answer is usually some variation of slave economies don't incentivize labor-saving technology. And there's something to that argument. But it doesn't account for what happened to the research itself. The Great Library was damaged or destroyed. Accounts differ, historians argue, and the precise sequence of losses at Alexandria is genuinely contested. What is not contested is this. The accumulated knowledge of roughly 7 centuries of coordinated Mediterranean scholarship did not survive intact. What we have are fragments, copies of copies, references in later texts to works that no longer exist. The part that keeps me up at night isn't the burning. Libraries burn. What keeps me up is the targeting. Because we have records, Roman, Byzantine, later Arab, of specific efforts to locate and suppress particular categories of Alexandrian text. Not the poetry, not the astronomy, the mechanical knowledge, the engineering, which brings me to a different civilization entirely and a different set of anomalies. The city of Teotihuacan, located roughly 50 kilometers northeast of modern Mexico City, was constructed beginning around 100 BCE and reached its peak population, estimated at somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 people. around 450 CE. This made it, at the time, one of the largest cities on Earth. It was, by every measurable metric, a functioning metropolis. I spent a long time with the infrastructure surveys because the infrastructure surveys are where Teotihuacan stops making sense under conventional assumptions. The city's drainage system, documented by archaeologists from the Mexican National Institute of Anthropology, beginning in the 1960s and continuing through surveys published as recently as 2021, involved a network of channels, pipes, and retention basins that could manage massive volumes of rainwater runoff. This is not remarkable. Ancient civilizations built drainage systems. What is remarkable is the material. Significant portions of Teotihuacan's water infrastructure were lined with mica, sheets of mica, carefully cut and installed. Mica is an excellent electrical insulator. It is also an excellent thermal insulator. In the 20th century, it became a critical material for early electrical capacitors and later for components in radar technology. Teotihuacan has no volcanic mica source within several hundred kilometers. The mica used in the city was imported at scale from regions in modern Brazil. No one has produced a fully satisfying explanation for why a pre-Columbian Mesoamerican city would import industrial quantities of an electrically insulating material from South America and use it to line water channels. The mica doesn't need to mean anything. It might be ritual. It might be aesthetics that we don't understand. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist. But consider the timing. Teotihuacan was not a city of stragglers. It was built at its foundation by engineers who clearly understood material science to a degree that continues to impress modern archaeologists. People who understood that mica had desirable properties used mica intentionally. What properties were they trying to exploit? Let me shift to a more recent chapter of this pattern, because the ancient world is easy to dismiss. History is distant. Records are fragmentary. Ambiguity is the condition of the past. The 20th century offers much less ambiguity. On January 7, 1943, Nikola Tesla died alone in room 3327 of the New Yorker Hotel. He was 86 years old, largely penniless, and had been in effective obscurity for the better part of 2 decades. Within hours of his death, the Office of Alien Property, acting through the FBI, seized all of Tesla's papers, notebooks, and research materials from his hotel room and from several storage facilities where he had kept his work. The official explanation is that Tesla's papers might contain information relevant to national security. That's plausible. There was a war on. Tesla had been working on, among other things, a system he called Teleforce, what journalists of the era described as a particle beam weapon. But the seizure was total. It was not a targeted review of weapons-adjacent research. Everything went. Personal correspondence, financial records, notebooks dating back to his earliest experiments with alternating current. Work on what Tesla described in his later years as a global wireless energy transmission system, technology he claimed would allow the broadcast of electrical power to any point on Earth without wires, drawing on what he characterized as virtually unlimited energy from the Earth's own electromagnetic resonance. The FBI file on Tesla was partially declassified in 2016 under a FOIA request. What those files reveal is that the seizure was thorough, that the materials were held by the alien property custodian, and that when Tesla's nephew eventually received some of the materials after the war, the most technically sensitive notebooks, those dealing specifically with the wireless energy transmission work, were not among them. They are described in internal government correspondence as having been transferred to a separate repository. The files don't say which one. That repository, as of the last substantive public records request I could find, has not been identified. Speaking of things that were transferred and never fully returned, there's the case of T. Henry Morey, a Utah electrical engineer who, beginning in the 1920s, publicly demonstrated a device he called the radiant energy receiver. Morey claimed the device could extract usable electrical power, hundreds of watts, demonstrated repeatedly in public and in private for visiting engineers, from what he described as cosmic radiation. The demonstrations were real. Multiple credentialed witnesses verified them. The device produced power even in insulated rooms, even when its antenna was disconnected. It had no internal batteries, no internal combustion, no apparent external power source. Let me be precise about what happened next, because the sequence matters. In 1938, a man named Felix Fraser was employed in Moray's laboratory. Fraser later attempted to disassemble the device's core component, what Moray called the detector, reportedly while Moray was absent. Moray discovered the attempt, dismissed Fraser, and found that critical components had been damaged. The device never worked again. Moray spent the next 4 decades trying to reconstruct it. He filed patents. He corresponded with government laboratories. He was turned down for funding by multiple federal agencies, including, according to his own account, a representative of what would later become the Department of Energy's predecessor office. Moray died in 1974. His son, John Moray, has maintained archives of the original work, including the original partially damaged detector components. They are, according to the most recent public statement from the Moray family, still intact. No credentialed laboratory has ever been permitted access for full technical analysis. That's not a dead end. That's a closed door. The pattern repeats. Not in the dramatic, conspiratorial way that makes it easy to dismiss, not shadowy men in black cars. In the institutional way, the bureaucratic way, the way funding gets discontinued, the way patents get challenged, the way the research that contradicts the dominant energy paradigm consistently seems to encounter friction at exactly the moments when it might achieve critical mass. You can find it in the story of Victor Schauberger, the Austrian forester who developed water implosion turbines in the 1930s and 1940s, whose work was seized by both the Nazi government during the war and by American engineers afterward under Operation Paperclip protocols, and whose subsequent attempts to reconstruct his technology in the United States, in partnership with an American company in the 1950s, ended with the company retaining all rights to his research and Schauberger returning to Austria, where he died within a week of arriving home in 1958. You can find it in the academic career of Dr. Eugene Malov, the MIT-trained physicist who resigned from his position at MIT in protest over what he characterized as the university's misrepresentation of cold fusion research results in 1989. Malov spent the following 15 years documenting what he argued was a systematic institutional suppression of low-energy nuclear reaction research. He was murdered in 2004. The case was solved. A robbery gone wrong, officially, but Malov's archives, which he had been preparing for publication, were dispersed. Maybe these are unconnected. Maybe each story has a mundane explanation, and the pattern I'm tracing is the pattern of a mind that wants to see connections in coincidence. But here's what matters. These aren't fringe characters in isolation. They are engineers with demonstrated results, scientists with institutional affiliations, researchers whose work was taken seriously enough by governments and corporations to be confiscated, purchased, or suppressed, not ignored. You don't ignore a threat. You ignore irrelevance. The number was 1882. That's what stopped me. Not the invention itself, the wires, the generators, the sudden blaze of electric light over lower Manhattan. What stopped me was the other number, buried 4 pages deeper in a footnote of a utility industry archive from 1896. A suppressed patent filing. 14 years. That's how long a technology sat in a locked drawer before anyone was allowed to speak its name in public. 14 years. Think about what 14 years means. It means entire cities were built without it. Millions of people were handed a different future, an inferior one, not because the better option didn't exist, but because it was inconvenient for the people holding the drawer shut. That's the part no textbook teaches. And once you start pulling that thread, the whole fabric of what we think we know about energy history starts to unravel in ways that are genuinely difficult to explain. I found this while researching something else entirely. I was tracing the financing history of early electrical infrastructure in the United States, mundane archival work, the kind that involves microfilm readers and handwritten ledgers from institutions that barely still exist. What I was looking for was a straightforward story about industrial investment. What I found instead was a pattern of suppression so consistent, spanning so many decades and so many continents, that I've spent the better part of 2 years trying to convince myself I'm wrong about it. I'm not sure I am. The timeline isn't subtle. From the late 19th century through the mid-20th, a remarkable number of engineers, inventors, and researchers arrived independently at energy systems that their contemporaries, and ours, would later describe as anomalous. Too efficient, too cheap to operate, too threatening to the infrastructures already being built around fuel extraction, distribution, and metered consumption. One by one, those systems encountered the same sequence of events. Initial acclaim, corporate interest, institutional friction, and then silence. Archives transferred, patents voided, laboratories closed. The men who built them discredited or simply forgotten. Maybe that's the natural history of failed technology. Things get tried. Things get abandoned. But the pattern suggests something more deliberate is at play. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The timeline isn't subtle, and the timeline connects. Baghdad, roughly 250 BCE. A working galvanic cell of unknown purpose. Alexandria, 1st century CE. A steam turbine described as a toy, alongside engineering texts that later disappear. Teotihuacan, 450 CE. A city with inexplicable quantities of industrially relevant insulating material in its infrastructure. London, 1882. A suppressed patent sitting in a drawer for 14 years while the city's electrical grid is built around a more expensive, more metered alternative. New York, 1943. A federal seizure of an inventor's complete life work within hours of his death. Utah, 1938. A functioning free energy demonstration, deliberately disabled by an agent whose subsequent history has never been fully traced. Austria/United States, 1958. An inventor who signed over his research under duress and died within a week of returning home. Oregon, 2004. A journalist about to publish a comprehensive account of institutional suppression, murdered before publication. Each of these incidents has an individual explanation. The galvanic cell might be coincidence of form. The Alexandrian texts were victims of general historical catastrophe. Teotihuacan's mica might be aesthetic or ritual. Tesla's papers were a wartime national security measure. Morey's device might have been fraud. Schauberger's technology might not have worked as advertised. Malov's death was officially random. Maybe. But the consistency of the mechanism, the way the suppression always comes at the moment of potential replication, of scaling, of moving from laboratory demonstration to functional infrastructure, that's not the pattern of coincidence. That's the pattern of a system protecting itself. Here is what I think this pattern suggests, and I want to be careful about how I frame it because I don't have answers. I have patterns. Energy, throughout human history, has been the fundamental source of economic and political power. Whoever controls the ability to do work, to move things, build things, process things, communicate things, controls the shape of civilization itself. The history of energy is therefore not primarily a history of technology. It is a history of control. When a technology appears that threatens the control mechanism, that offers power without scarcity, energy without metering, light and heat and motion without a bill attached, it doesn't fail because it doesn't work. It fails because making it work is incompatible with the interests of the people positioned to decide what gets developed and what gets buried. This is not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It doesn't require a room full of men in agreement. It only requires that the institutional incentives consistently reward suppression and consistently punish development of energy technologies that cannot be owned and sold. And those incentives have been consistent. Historically, empirically, demonstrably consistent. The archival trail doesn't end. That's the thing I keep returning to when the scale of what I'm describing starts to feel like too much. The Baghdad Battery is in the Iraq Museum, or it was before the events of 2003, when the museum was looted. Its current location is, and this is in the official record, uncertain. Hero of Alexandria's complete works exist only in Byzantine manuscripts, several of which are held at restricted access in monastic archives on Mount Athos, accessible only to male Orthodox pilgrims. Tesla's most sensitive notebooks are in a repository that the FBI files describe but do not name. Morey's detector is in a private family archive that no credentialed laboratory has been allowed to examine. Schauberger's original implosion turbine prototypes, built in Austria in the early 1940s, are listed in the archives of the Victor Schauberger Research Institute as location unknown. These materials exist, or they existed, or they exist and someone has decided that their existence should remain quiet. I don't know which. What I know is this: the history of energy is not the history of discovery and development and improvement we were taught. It is a history of discovery, suppression, rediscovery, and suppression again, stretching back further than we're comfortable admitting, and continuing, the pattern suggests, into the present. The machines that powered ancient cities, or might have, are in filing cabinets and museum basements and monastery libraries and unnamed government repositories. Some are almost certainly gone. Some are almost certainly not. And somewhere, in a room I can't name, in an archive that hasn't been declassified, in a drawer that hasn't been opened in decades, there is probably something that would change everything. The question isn't whether it's there. The question is who decided you shouldn't see it.